So today we get to talk to Dr. Julie Gurner, very, very fun person who's deep on what makes humans exceptional. I've heard people describe her as, if you're familiar with the show Billions, I've heard people describe her as the real life Wendy Rhoades. She works with the kind of the best of the best in startups and investing, and we're very excited to dive in and learn from her.
Yeah, there's a certain type of person that tries to do crazy things, and she happens to specialize in helping those people. And so anyone listening to this conversation is going to get a glimpse of what it looks like to work with her and some of the learnings that she's had, helping some of the best founders and investors in the world as they go through some of their problems. So it's a fascinating convo. We're stoked to have her on the podcast, and I think everyone's going to enjoy it.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're excited for the combo. We've got a lot of founders and investors who are going to really, really get some benefit out of this conversation today. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. So, I started very traditionally in psychology. I don't know that I knew my field was even possible when I began. I started in adult psychopathology, and forensics was my area of expertise. It was an area that really required a deep understanding of personality theory and assessment, and really understanding people at a very deep level, sometimes people who are doing very extreme things. And so I started off there, doing work assessing people for, mental state at the time of the crime, people doing competency to stand trial and those types of things. That was my initial training. I moved on to, kind of doing some teaching and other things in personality theory, having a very deep understanding of that, had been contacted to do some advising on products from time to time in the technology space, had a venture firm, really reach out after I was, had done some advising and said, hey, you're the only psychology person we know. We're having a founder of one of our portfolio companies who's struggling to make some decisions after a round. Can you just talk to him? And so I did that. And, it was like a light bulb moment for me, really hand in glove. I saw the problem immediately. And it was fantastic for me to see someone who was healthy, well, ambitious, and, not ill, which is the, kind of background you're used to. But instead of going from like illness to health, really going from a very healthy person who had this little minor tweak that we could make that kind of really was easy to fix and kind of move forward on. And so after like 3 meetings, the guy's doing great. He's back up to par. It was a very minor thing. And I just began to feel like, hey, if this guy is having challenges, I'm betting this need exists elsewhere. And I really started to actively kind of do that work and put myself out there. I had a company that had a very significant, $500 million plus exit. I started to get a really good reputation, and then started to kind of get a lot of internal referrals. It was quickly something that, I realized that not only did I really love personally, but could do a lot of good.
That's honestly a very wild transition to kind of go from like you said, the people who are like struggling so much so that they're, like criminal, like on that spectrum. And then you're working with like the Ferraris about like, hey, how do we fine tune this to go a little bit faster? Was that just like a wildly different experience for you from an energy perspective? Like, was one draining and one like reinvigorating? I'm just curious how that was.
I think for me, I've always liked edge cases. And so for me, looking at kind of edge cases where you're at, like, let's say a Supermax facility where someone's at, they've done some pretty terrible things. They're there 20 years plus. They, like one guy had reported, which I thought was really interesting, it was a bad 10 minutes, and that 10 minutes determined the rest of their life. And, you really start to think about, like, for me, that was energizing, but there was really a lot of limitations on what you can do. And there was a lot of imposed limits on not just what you could do with individuals, but where you could go as far as kind of making change. And for me, that's a very frustrating experience to say like, hey, I'm going to bump up against these walls and I'm never going to get any further. I'm never going to be able to do any more good. And, you know, there's only so much that you're allowed to do, able to do. And for me, the assessments did get very draining because I'm there just to assess what I see, and I'm not there to do anything further in many of these cases. So I can say what I've, been able to assess, but in, jumping to people who are very high performers, there is no ceiling. The capacity is limitless. You have the ability to really expand out. And I think what people don't really see is even though my clients can expand out and be, just absolutely phenomenal at what they do, it allows me to flex out cognitively too. Yeah. And that is deeply fulfilling for me.
Julie, we, Sterling and I have had the fun privilege of working with a bunch of founders now, and we have this phrase that they are often the right kind of crazy. And I'm curious if you can explore that line between the wrong kind of crazy and the right kind of crazy, or whether you even agree with that premise, because our observation is that these are pretty extreme people, and the logic is that only extreme personalities can produce extreme outcomes like a startup. And so would love it if you talked us through how you've drawn that line and what makes good crazy versus bad.
And maybe just one thing too on that is what are the similarities between someone in a supermax and someone who's like, if any? I think Tyler's asking it well, but that's a fascinating thing to look at both ends and see where the similarities are.
I think that people who operate at the extremes, like being an outlier person, is required to have outlier results. And I think that the thing that I see with people who are really, when you're talking about like investment thesis and looking at founders, one of the things that I see in people who do very large scale things is that they see the world as malleable. It's not fixed. And they have a deep belief that they can do things that other people would probably say are unreasonable, impossible. And that default setting really does kind of filter down even into the people they want on their teams or be around them. A common theme, for example, is that I would say that everyone I work with at the upper levels does not want someone around them that says can't, that is negative, that doesn't think things are possible. It's not that they want yes men, but they want problem solvers and people who are really thinking about things creatively and willing to go into those spaces. I think where it gets to be a kind of bad outlier and bad unreasonable is when there isn't a way of looking at consequences and, an understanding of who you are in the world. I think that people who end up doing bad things really lack sometimes that ability to care about or understand their place in the world in the consequences of their actions. And people who are doing unreasonable good, I think oftentimes are very attuned to the consequences of their actions. And in fact, it's a great driver for them because they see what they have the potential to do. And there's this kind of deep self-belief that they can make good on a very expansive and almost radical path forward. And they want other people on that ship that can, that believe in that too. And often they do believe in it because of the force of the person kind of leading the charge. So that's kind of how I think about like that particular trait, I suppose.
It's fascinating to think about the distinction between like an Elon Musk versus somebody who ends up in prison for fraud, right? Like, and sometimes that line is pretty, I don't know, it seems sometimes like there's a lot more gray there than we give credit to. Would you agree with that?
I agree that there is a level that can be a bit gray, but I think that there's a moxie that like kind of is that overlapping element sometimes. That you have to have moxie, not just to kind of, when I say the world is malleable, sometimes you bend the rules, and bending those rules can go in positive directions or not. And I think that's why you end up seeing things like, Sam Bankman-Fried, you end up seeing like, Elizabeth Holmes. When you look at the story of Elizabeth Holmes, it sometimes feels as though it was initially a very well-intentioned person who believed something was possible, but kind of got ahead of their skis, ended up selling something that wasn't actually happening. It costs, people's health and a number of other things. But you can see how people cross that line, and you want to be really cautious that with all the hype that you don't kind of cross that line yourself. But there are people who could have had the potential to do incredible things.
Julie, you mentioned a couple of traits there that I'd love to explore a little more. One of them is you view the world as malleable. You can affect yourself on the world. You're an agent. Yeah. That is kind of by definition what a founder is. They're saying that something doesn't exist and they're going to go build it. So I'm curious, for all the founders that listen to this podcast, how do you build that muscle of viewing the world as malleable? Is it something you can build, or are people born that way?
I think that people are okay. So it's an interesting question, because I tend to see the people who are already at the place where they view it in that way. So It's hard to say.
Yep.
But I can tell you that people don't get to like $1 billion companies who don't see it that way. I find that sometimes what I encounter, and I'll see it with founders who are maybe in their second or third or fourth company. Like I had a founder who built to like a $3 million company and would always hit against the wall, and then things went wrong. Built another company, got to like 5, things went wrong. And now he's at like a company that's like $150, $200 million company, kind of figured something out and was able to kind of get beyond these certain internal barriers. So I do think that it's something that if you're willing to dive into yourself and see like, what walls am I hitting against here, and really challenge yourself, the company can only go as far as you can.
Yeah.
So you have to be able to see that if you are not the person who can see the world in this way, your company will never get there. And I think sometimes a primary problem I see in earlier stage founders when I get to work with them is that the company is really leading them. Like they're almost like reactive to the demands of the business, instead of being the person who's out front and like driving the business forward behind them. And, you need to be the pace setter.
Yep.
And I think sometimes with earlier founders, the company is setting the pace and they're like reacting to the company's demands. But that's not the way that big things are made.
Yeah, we have a founder we've invested in that Sterling and I know well. And he was at an event a couple weeks ago and someone was asking, hey, how do you know when to let someone go, when it's time to fire them? And what you just said reminded me of what he said, which is, if they're pulling the company, I keep them around. If the company's pulling them, they've got to go. And so you've got to set the pace, I think, that's part and parcel with the malleable mindset you talked about. I got one more, Sterling. This is going to be fun one, I can tell. By the way, what it would be fun to do here, Julie, is try and deconstruct a formula of the types of people who do great things. And we've covered one of them, which is you see things as malleable. You mentioned one more, which is a deep sense of self-belief. Can you talk about why that's so important, and also whether that's learned or people come that way, and your views on that deep sense of belief, where it comes from?
I think that people prove themselves out over time. I feel like, that's a pattern in people's lives. They overcome hard things. They see themselves as having agency. They see themselves like it's survivor versus victim mindset a lot of times. But the thing to do big things is that you need to be default aggressive. Every one of them is default aggressive. And so in order to be default aggressive, you have to believe that whatever you're pushing forward is kind of like, you have to be confident in order to do that and to sit in that space. Yep. So I think that that's where the self-belief is so important, because if your company is going to be great and you're a default aggressive position, you have to believe that the moves that you're making, and you're making them quickly, are the right moves for the business, and you're willing to kind of be okay if things aren't necessarily 100% right. There's a joke, I'm like one of my current clients, his company is worth over $1 billion at this point. We always make a joke that like by the time he tells me something, it's already happening, and we meet weekly, right? Like so, but by the time he's talking to me about it, it's already in process. And so it's kind of funny, because when we had first started working together, he would mention something and we would kind of chat about it. But then over time, I started to realize, oh my gosh, every time I hear something, it's already happening. There's the window between, kind of what someone wants to do and when they do it. Like we talk about a bias to action, but the window is incredibly narrow. It's not like a bias to action, like, oh, this will happen in the next quarter, which is aggressive for some publicly traded companies, which I also, have experience with. But this is like, well, the CEO or the founder is, wants this to happen. It begins happening, like the process begins the next day.
Yeah.
It's not, the next quarter or, kind of down the line. And it's not that they don't care about the long term. They're thinking about that, but it's, they put things into action very quickly when they need to.
Why do you think that aggression is so important, to act so quickly as opposed to being more contemplative and waiting and seeing? What is the reason that aggression is so valuable?
I think one is that it's a reflection of the trust they have in themselves, that kind of self-belief that I mentioned. But also, if you think about it, if you have somebody who's very contemplative and making decisions on they need 80% of the information, the pace of that company is going to be pretty, they're going to make one step and then, that next quarter they'll make another, and the next quarter they'll make another. But if you're operating where you're just step analyze, you're so much further ahead. And then you end up lapping those people because you're making calls on 40% of the information, and you trust yourself, so much more. And you have a team that will implement and execute at that pace too. I think that it's funny, when you start to get inside some of the companies that build quickly, and then you take, if you took a field trip to some of these other companies that are, institutions, it becomes very clear why technology is moving at the pace that it does compared to kind of legacy companies.
Fascinating.
Okay, so like a lot of the same questions Tyler's asking are popping up for me, but if you go back to the being pulled versus being pushed by the company, I'm curious how often you see people recover from that versus once you're behind, it's like you're almost already underwater and it's just sort of inevitable. And if people do recover from that, how do they recover from that? So if someone's listening to this and they're like, hey, if I'm being honest, I'm drowning here. What have you seen work when people get back in front and start pulling?
Yeah, good question. I just made some notes, so if you saw me turn away, I want to make sure I answer you on this because it's a great question. I think when people understand that they are behind the ball on their company and they're reactive, they feel overwhelmed, they're just putting out fires all day. That's kind of how they begin to sense it and how it begins to feel. I think it's recoverable, honestly. But I think what ends up happening is sometimes even the best intentioned people, and even people who are well positioned to succeed, they allow the company to get ahead of them. And so it's this particular way in which you approach recovery is to start looking at, okay, first of all, I always look at what is someone's highest and best use in their own company. What are the things that as a founder or as a CEO that are things that only you can do, that are the highest value things that you can do? And let's get really clear on what those are first. So, for some people, it may be, raising capital and do it. There may be a number of things that they need to do, hiring, vision stuff, new initiatives, working on product, whatever it is. And all of these, and then we start to look at what are all the other things that you're doing right now. Maybe they're deeply involved in areas they shouldn't be. They are kind of micromanaging areas, or maybe they don't have the right people around them who can take on certain amounts of the load, so they're doing too much. They don't have good systems set up. They aren't architecting their company in a way that I think is really important for smooth operations. And we start looking at, let's start to hit all these areas. So let's clearly define what only you can do and what your highest best use is. And then let's look at everything else on your plate and start to figure out how we can put this in a place where it can be systematized, managed, architected, other people are taking it. And then you can do those high value things and start to really push ahead and push forward. And at various stages of company, those things are different, right? Early stage, you have to be doing all this stuff. But as you continue to move forward, you're I see it as an evolution of you pulling more and more into, your own areas of strength, to where you get to the point where you are only, like, you look at Bezos when he talked about, before he kind of left the CEO seat, where he's talking about, hey, I make 2 or 3 high leverage decisions every day, and that's my highest and best use. And other people are taking care of, all of these other things. He knew what his role was. He took it very seriously, and he certainly, did a phenomenal job doing what he needed to do.
Go ahead, Sterling.
Oh, no, sorry, go ahead.
So for an early stage founder who is still in the mode where they're doing like everything, they're the head of sales, they're the head of product, they're the head of engineering. In practice, what does that look like? Because they can't really delegate it to other folks, but they also can't get swallowed by their company because they're going to fail. What do you tell people that are in that early stage that don't have the ability to Jeff Bezos delegate? What should they do?
Well, because Jeff he wasn't making 2 or 3 decisions when he was working out of that, garage,
That's true.
So what does it look like?
I think that one of the things you can do is first start to architect what this company will look like. And then you begin to kind of there was one guy, I thought this was kind of brilliant. He had almost like an org chart, but it had empty hats, empty seats. And then the people who were there had 3 or 4 hats, right, that they were each wearing. And then eventually, as you start to grow, those hats get given to kind of other people. And he's also wearing hats, a number of hats. And so, I think that you have to have a vision for the future of how you're going to scale out. It can't be something that is just, left to chance or we'll figure it out then. I think that you really have to be an architect of sorts. And then you're doing, if we're really honest, you're pulling a lot more work at that stage. So it's not like, oh, I just come in and I work my 9 to 5 and I go home.
Yeah.
You're doing all of the jobs. But then what I usually hear is that a founder's working second shift, where then he's really doing his work, his highest work that ends up happening sometimes in the off hours, late hours, early mornings, where those things still have to get done. I think the benefit as your company scales is that then you start fitting your work more into your time, like a more traditional time frame where you can do that more during the day. But I think about people being an architect of their company so they know exactly how those areas are going to fill, what they're going to look like, who's carrying what for now, what they have to carry for now, and how roles are really distributed so that people have very clear swim lanes. And I think that clarity is important for a number of reasons, right? Expectations, accountability, even for yourself and for other people around you.
So I love this. By the way, when I onboard people and you're in a fairly early stage startup, I say you have a day job and a night job. And your day job is to win the day, right? You sell, you code, you program, whatever it is. And then your night job is to work on the infrastructure, and you're using the word architecture, which I really like, and sort of that scalable plan. And I always tell people, you'll fail if you don't do both. If you do one or the other, you'll fail. And the only way is to do both simultaneously. And in the early days, that really does look like it's just sort of above and beyond. And it really doesn't work any other way. So that really resonates with me.
I love that. No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it gets a lot of pushback and a lot of criticism because people say, oh, it's a hustle culture or, you work too much. But that's just the way it is. You're going to have these periods of intensity. And if you're not willing to kind of jump in, you're going to have a mediocre company. It's just the way that it works.
Yeah. You don't really get to choose. These are kind of like the laws of physics, right?
Right.
And
I agree.
And you can choose to fit it all in a 9 to 5. You're just going to live with the exact consequences of that. And you will be displaced by somebody who's doing it differently. Right.
Agree. 100%.
So if we go back to my desire to find this formula, we started with malleability, and then we said a deep sense of self-belief, and then aggression to act that's almost like a sense of urgency that others would find crazy, that you're just acting. Julie, are there any other big ingredients here that we haven't covered that you find are very, very common patterns among the top founders you work with?
Yeah, I think the other thing that's really important, especially if you're early and kind of developing who you are, is that they really lean into themselves and they're not like playing the CEO. Like, I don't know if that makes sense, but like sometimes people come in and they're like, this is what a CEO is supposed to be like. This is what a CEO is supposed to do. And I think that for some people, some elements that a traditional CEO would do are not very well suited to them. And that's okay. You know, you can have someone else doing those things. And I think other times, you know, and people feel like they have to take them on because that's just what a CEO does. So I do think that one of the things I see is that they very much lean into themselves and their own strengths, and that the things that they're genuinely not good at, they're pretty honest about. And they're like, look, I just, you know, I know that a CEO should maybe do this, but I really suck at it. And so I have, you know, somebody else doing this particular part of the business. And that's okay. I think understanding who you are and being brutally honest about that and leaning into your strengths more as you're able to do it is really the way that you're going to have momentum. Because if you think about it, when you spend time in things that you genuinely aren't good at, you genuinely struggle with, like those aren't areas that are going to move quickly or be done as well as they could be with somebody who's genuinely great at those things.
Yeah.
So I think that they understand that. And they're really brutally honest about it. I think sometimes we see people who are doing large things and we think, oh, must have this huge ego. But I find that they're just really honest about things that they're not good at too. And they're not hesitant to give those to someone else.
So I think there's a couple very interesting parts of that. Number one is I do think the sort of sincerity and authenticity is a real thing. And you do get caught up in like the books you've read or the podcasts you've listened to, and you think like, well, I need to be like so-and-so. And it's just wrong, right? Like if you're going to do anything interesting, it's going to be because of the quirks and the brokenness of the way that you see the world. And so you watch people kind of get watered down. And I would say particularly in the good years, a lot of great people got watered down and got talked back from their extremes when really that's just like the wrong advice. And so you're hitting on that, number one, and then you're saying, while leaning into your extremes, make sure that you're not neglecting other things that are very important, and that's how you think about building a team or rounding yourself out. And is that a fair kind of summation?
I think that's a great summation. I think the thing to remember as you're reading all those books about great people, I mean, look for it, because if you read biographies or autobiographies, you'll find that whether you're looking at early titans or you're looking at people today, they all lean into what they're great at. And they all are like, you know, the things that they're not so good at, I think are sometimes very apparent to other people, and they don't do those things. And it's also why there's only one, like, you know, there's one Jobs, there's one Musk, and they're that way because they are unique and because they've leaned into that, not because they all tried to be the same person. It's what made them distinctive and special. So I hope that people out there see that your own quirks, as you put them, are absolute kind of cheat codes to doing things your way, and be okay leaning into those things. Other people don't have to understand them. They don't have to like them all of the time, but it's like how you do business. And I think it's really important.
Julie, do you help people lean in or first discover what their unique authenticity is, then their strengths are? And if so, how do you do that in your work? What do you do to help people lean into their authenticity?
I think that Sterling touched on one of those things, which is, where do you really find energy? What are you really like energized by? And I think that the things that oftentimes, it's not always a perfect correlation, but the things that you're energized by, the things that you love, and the things that you're personally obsessed with are often the things that really can be your specific, kind of magical touch points of the business. So if you're somebody who's really obsessed with, like I have, people who are obsessed with the product, right? Like they're just obsessed with it. That's like their area. People who are obsessed with growth and like that's all they care about. It's all that they see, kind of the next, M&A transaction, way of growing market share, being kind of larger. So whatever that thing is for you, and where you get energy, where you're excited, the things you're excited about. Like if you look at your calendar, I think that you can probably go through and do a couple of things. You say, well, what are my top priorities? And you look and, does your calendar really reflect that? But then like, what are the things that I'm genuinely excited about, great at, that I feel like I can uniquely push harder than anyone else? Because if you think about it, if we look at people on any kind of a curve, if you're already ahead of people on something, you're already really great at something. And most people, if they're not humble or shy, they can say, look, I'm above the average guy at X, Y, or Z. If you can lean into that and push that forward, you go really parabolic. Like if you're trying to get something you're poor at and bring it up to average, you're never going to be really as exceptional as somebody who is already kind of standard deviations ahead, and then they push that thing forward. So I want people who are already great at something to really lean into it, to go kind of parabolic in that area. And people who are below the curve, I'm happy to help them get up to average on it so they can get by and they feel good about it. But that's not an area that you should really be leaning into. Like, bring your skills up to average. Like, not everyone's going to be a financial master in their company. Sometimes that's an area of challenge. But like, there are a number of different areas you don't have to be exceptional at. But the things that you are, really pay attention to them and figure out ways to use those to really kind of make your business very distinctive and to help it grow.
Awesome.
One of the things that I think is going to be very applicable for the people who listen to this is because they're doing a lot of interviewing and they're doing a lot of hiring. And a lot of what we're talking about is how to, number one, like suss out those attributes in sort of initial interactions and then work on them over time.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, when you're working with somebody new for the first time, what are you paying attention to, and what are the real markers of like, oh, like this person is going to be special. Like I can help them be more than what they are today, but the raw material is there because it's very, very correlated to how people are hiring and building businesses.
It's a really interesting question. I think that there is, first I want to just make a comment about hiring, and it's probably one of the best things I had heard from a guy when he hires, what he looks for. And he said, I always hire people that I feel I'll need to hold back. And I love that he wants to be able to hold them. Like, I feel like I'm going to need to hold this person back, not that I'm going to have to push them. And that to me was always a really interesting way of thinking about the people you want to bring into your business. Like, these are people who are pushers. They're going to move. You're going to almost have to say, hey, like, not yet.
Chill out.
You want those people. I love that. Right. Like, it's so fantastic when you get those people who are almost like you have to rein them in. So I thought that was a great indication around hiring and people who come in the door. But for people with me, I think that, it's hard to put your finger on, right? Like, there are people who are hungry, that are just not going to be stopped, who will win with or without you, who is they're just not going to be able to be contained. And I have a hard time figuring out exactly what that special something is, but it certainly is a gut read when you meet it. It's somebody who's so exceptional. Right now on my caseload of people, I have, someone who's, running $1 billion company. I have someone who's heading a publicly traded company, a few people at like 250 million plus, one at like $500 million, and a number of people who are, at various stages of building, and maybe a couple of executives. And I think to myself, like, what makes people be kind of special in this way? I feel like I get a poor sample, honestly, because these are people who are coming to me because they want to grow and be better and bigger. So I think that I only get to see people who are of a certain group of people.
You've got the positive select of all positive selects. Yeah.
I think so. And it couldn't make me happier to have that. Yeah. But I do think also, though, it makes me a very poor judge of like who's going to be an outlier, because I get a decent amount of them coming my way.
You only deal with outliers, basically. Yeah.
With a lot of them. And I think that, it's funny. I have an initial 30-minute just kind of intro call with folks. And And that intro call is as much for them to kind of like meet and us to chat as it is for me to kind of filter, who I would want to work with. And I think you want to work with people who want to push themselves and have that kind of default aggressive, will do what it takes personality. So that's, kind of, it's hard to put my finger on it. So I think I'm going to not be able to answer that question as well as I would hope.
If you did, you'd probably increase the GDP of the world. I think it's the one that everybody's kind of trying to figure out. But so this is another question, and I think helpful for people who are in company building and investing too. But what are the things you've come to believe that cannot be coached? They must be, natural. Otherwise, there's really nothing that anybody can do to sort of pull it out of you.
Yeah, I think you need to have internal drive. I think it needs to be internal, not external. I mean, it can't be, you have to want it for yourself, and you have to want it no matter what is around you, no matter if being a founder is cool or not, whether it's, I think that the challenge is that internal drive is so important because a lot of your work is never going to get, if you're going to go anywhere large, is not going to get reinforced by anyone else. Like spending hours in front of a computer doing boring stuff is what it's going to take. You have to be willing to do the boring stuff. And the boring is not going to, kind of pat you on the back. And it's going to require that you put in a lot of time with things that are not quick rewards. So I think that internal drive is really important. I think also people who are able to kind of pass the marshmallow test, you talk about, like that, they're okay if they don't touch that marshmallow for a very long time. They can play the long game. They understand that the immediate rewards aren't necessarily going to come. And they are going to keep pushing just day after day to kind of get to that point. So I think those are two things that I see is that if you are somebody who wants immediate rewards, building anything big is not going to be for you. If you're somebody who's motivated by external things versus having an internal drive, building a big thing is not for you. If you want to, I think that the world is built for people who want instant gratification, right? Like skip all of this and, take this one course and you're going to be, wildly successful. And that's just not kind of the way in which ultimate, like kind of large companies are built. And you go through naysayers and you go through what other people are going to tell you. If you look back at old videos, you'll see that people told, Musk that he, wouldn't be able to do SpaceX. You have to hear very public critique. Sometimes you'll hear it from investors over and over again when you're trying to raise capital that your idea isn't going to work. But if you don't carry something internally that says, you know what, it's their problem, not my problem. It's like they're missing it, not that I'm not going to be able to do it. You're not going to be able to have a lot of success. So there's this kind of internal drive. But I think also there's a type of resiliency that is really required that is really, really hard to build. You have to be able to take a lot of knocks and just keep going and see that, you can stand up, that you're going to do better and that you're going to eventually make it. And you can't be the person who takes a few hits and stays down. And unfortunately, I think that the hits are hard and it hurts and people give up and you lose a lot of potentially talented people that way.
This is something that Tyler and I have actually been talking about a lot recently. As life gets easier, everything gets easier, right? Like every generation, right? And it's maybe the easiest time it's certainly the easiest time it's ever been. You think about anything, just pick it, right? Our cars drive themselves, our software writes itself, like you name it. Stuff that used to be really, really hard is becoming easier. And what you worry about is that resiliency and where are you going to get it? And it's going to be harder and harder to get that. And you listen to someone like Jensen at NVIDIA and he says, I wish on you suffering. It's very similar to what you just talked about. But it's like, where are we going to get it when everything's so easy? Where do you get your suffering so that you build your resiliency? How's it going to look?
I often will challenge people if, to build it outside of their area of work, push yourself on something that you didn't think you could achieve. And that translates into your work in ways that people don't anticipate. I'll have someone to say like, hey, like I have one client in the past who would like sign up for these triathlons, right? Didn't think that he could do it, but would have to dedicate all this training to it, hired a trainer, did all this stuff. But just achieving some things and pushing yourself in ways outside of work sometimes can translate internally. And if I would kind of bring anything else to the forefront on things that are probably not as trainable, it's, Paul Graham's notion of resourcefulness. You see that over and over again, that people make do with what they have in ways that others just couldn't anticipate. And I think sometimes that takes a special set of eyes and a special like kind of positioning to be able to see those resources you have available. With like Brian Chesky going into places and seeing like the potential for rooms to be rented out. We've all been in spaces and didn't see that potential. We just saw, we have a few spare rooms. You have a different set of eyes. And I think that it's a real brilliance that some people carry.
Julie, I hope you don't mind, but what I'd love to do is ask you about a couple of your tweets that you've sent out.
Sure.
We were talking before, and I was going through and kind of prep for the convo, and over half of my bookmark tweets come from you. So it's great content.
It's amazing. There's some very strong themes, and I thought it would be valuable for some of our listeners to hear you expand on a couple of these. So one of them is from like a month ago. You said, never speak poorly of yourself, even as a joke. It's not funny, it's not relatable, and it's not cute. It's destructive. Why? Why do you say that?
Yeah, I really do believe that, the kind of the worst thing that you can do is to position yourself as, kind of make fun of yourself. I don't think that it's how you speak about yourself is a form of self-definition. And you really teach other people how to treat you as well, right? So if you're kind of a joke to yourself, other people feel permission to kind of joke at your expense also. And it's not a way that you want to teach people to relate to you. And it's certainly not a way that you want to model relating to yourself. You speak of yourself highly. Other people, you hope that you act in ways in which other people speak of you highly. You kind of want to model a good sense of self. And I think that, when you do see it and people think it's a bit funny is usually when it comes from the top, right? Because people are trying to be relatable. But they're doing that by putting themselves down, anticipating that to be relatable to you means that I have to lower myself in order to be at your level, which is kind of insulting in and of itself. I do think that it's just something that we've learned in society to kind of be okay with. And I'm happy to call out the things that I find to be chipping away at our internal self that we get a little lazy on. And I think that's a lazy way of relating to other people.
Makes sense. I got one more, and then maybe Sterling has a couple he wants to talk about. But this one's from, I think, yesterday or today. The world is full of absolute cowards. They don't risk anything in their actions. They don't say anything with their words. They never go against the grain, lean into their own quirks, or try anything unreasonable. Don't be one of those people. Live life with volume up. I know we've talked about this theme kind of throughout the 30 or 40 minutes we've talked through, but what prompted that tweet of avoiding being a coward, and why do you feel so strongly about that?
Anytime you want to do anything great or different, it means you're going to have to pop your head up, right? I mean, like if you want to stay in the herd, you can do that, but your life will look like that and your potential will be capped there.
Yeah.
I always assume that there are people out there and, that really have the urge to see what they're capable of and can max out their own capacity. And it can never happen if you don't take risks. And these interpersonal risks that feel so large, like, oh, someone might make fun of me. Someone might think, all eyes are going to be on me because, maybe you had a really successful exit and now you're trying something yourself. Whatever that situation is, because it can apply to so many people, if you don't take the risk, you never get to the other side, right?
Yeah.
You're going to hold yourself under this barrier forever and ever. And I think that when you talk to, I'd give people the challenge that if you want to do an experiment, go out and talk to people that you know in your family, your friends, and older people, and ask them what they wanted to be. Ask them what did you want to be when you were 20? What did you hope your life would look like? And see how many people actually have attained that vision of the thing that they wanted, because it's a real shocker how many people have said, well, I wanted to do this, but life got in the way. There'll be a reason, right? And sometimes those reasons are legit. Somebody, had cancer, or, there were challenges that, genuinely could not be overcome. But most of the time it's because people settled for something that became very comfortable, and they just didn't want to put forth the effort or risk anything anymore. And it's kind of a sad, regretful moment. And you don't want to end up like that. I'm all for regret minimization.
One follow-up on this is, I imagine a lot of people don't stick their head up and take the risk because of a fear of failure. And I'm curious what you see among those who do they get over that fear of failure? Should we even fear failure, Julie? Or how do healthy outlier performance people think about failure?
Or do they not process it at all because they're that crazy?
I think there's a few things. One is that I think most people don't fear failure as much as they fear failing in front of other people. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's not necessarily always the experience of not being able to do something, but that other people will see them not doing it.
Yep.
Or failing at it. So I think that social judgment means a lot to most people. What I've noticed, and again, it might be a little controversial to say, is that most people who are at higher levels see failures as kind of blips. I did I'm doing all of these things and one thing didn't hit. It's like the Fire Phone. None of us use a Fire Phone, absolute failure of a product. But did that really register? I don't think it probably did. Probably made someone angry for a period of time, and then that kind of passed. So I think once you're at a certain level, you have so much behind you that supports that you are doing good things, on the right path, building something incredible, that when you do have failures, you're very quick to not take some things as personally. And I think that sometimes failure, even if it is personal in some ways, is seen more as, for example, it's not this level of detachment, but it's an example of the kind of ways you think about it. Is that if you're doing a research paper, you have a hypothesis, right?
Yep.
You have a hypothesis. And sometimes when you do the project, it actually disproves the hypothesis. You're wrong. You did all this research and it turns out you're wrong. You go back and you say, well, why am I wrong? And then you kind of do this analysis around it. But you don't say, well, I was wrong. I'm a failure. This was terrible. You say, well, it was wrong. Let's take a look at why. And then let's kind of move forward and go to the next thing. And I feel like it's a very similar way in which I think they take the hit. I think it stings. I don't think anybody gets away from that. I think that they can be angry about it. If it's public, I think especially they get angry about it. But I see more in, to be honest, anger and frustration than I do sadness or humiliation or any of those kind of personal things. And I definitely see that they'll process that very quickly and say, why did this happen? Let's not make this mistake again, and kind of move forward. It's if you're a sports team and you lose a game, you don't forever stay we're just never going to play football again. You say, well, we lost this game. Let's look at the tape. Let's see what happened. And then the next game you go out there and, you fix it and you move forward. So it isn't always popular to say, but I don't think that people who are doing larger things are impacted as strongly by the failures because they're just in a different position. Yeah. The people early on, I think, take it sometimes as signal that it shouldn't be.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fascinating point, and I love that we're ending here because it's interesting to me because you kind of have this thing of failure on one hand, cowardice on the other, but you actually failed with your act of cowardice, going back to your test of, hey, go talk to people in your life and see how they measured up to when they had when they had a grand vision for themselves. And it's you fail just as easy not trying, but at least you weren't a coward. And I think when you just look at a life well lived, failure's part of the package. But the other stuff is a choice, right? And you can live with one of those. In fact, I think you have a better life. You have a more full journey, a more full experience. But one of those, you just start dying early. It just looks a little more comfortable. And that's what makes founders so special, is that most of them don't end up creating, the $1 billion company, but damn it, like they weren't a coward, right? Like in a world that kind of incentivizes comfort and cowardice. And I think more and more as life gets easier and easier.
Should we wrap up with our 3 normal questions, Sterling?
Yep.
Oh, no.
Yeah, we've got 3 quick questions. They're more rapid fire than the others. And by the way, before we get there, tell others who are interested in learning more about how to work with you how they could.
Sure. I mean, I have a newsletter, Ultra Successful, on Substack, where I try to distill learnings from folks and put them into, kind of a weekly newsletter. I offered my first course on Maven on kind of outlier leadership. So, I'll probably be offering that again coming up. There's a wait list for that. I think we have a couple thousand people in that upcoming. So excited about that. And then you can always find me on Twitter, as you all referenced. It's at Dr. Gurner. I'm genuinely on there when I'm on there, and I'm always happy to interact with folks.
Awesome. All right. So the last 3, I'll take the first one, which is, is there an investor that you admire more than others that you've studied or worked with? And then Sterling's going to ask you about an operator, and then He gave me
the hard one. Yeah.
Well, it's funny. The investor, I would never say if I have worked with someone. That's not something that I do. But an investor, actually, I very much admire because, both his personal investments and the investments he makes is Peter Thiel. I think he's a phenomenal investor. I like that he does everything from biotech to some really interesting products. So I think that he's probably one of my favorite investors that, I've certainly seen some of the companies that he's put money into.
So the second question is the same, but it's around an entrepreneur. And again, to make it easier on you, let's make sure it's no one you've worked with. So just somebody that maybe you've admired from afar. But who's your favorite entrepreneur?
Favorite entrepreneur? Give me a moment here.
Just go right back to Peter Thiel because, he did both, right?
He did do both, but I don't know that he's absolutely my favorite. I really do like. There's some who are, I guess, executives that I really think are really cool. I was going to go with, the head of AMD, Lisa Su, who is a really interesting, interesting leader and really very much like an expert in her craft. Definitely one of my favorite kind of leaders there at AMD. So I think that would be one of my favorite, if I were going to say, probably not an entrepreneur in that way, but very entrepreneurial in their role.
Operator, it counts. All right. And then the last one, Dr. Gurner, is we call it the golden spur question, and we'll turn the tables on you and kind of act as your psychologist here. What drives you? What is it that makes you the way that you are? Why are you the way that you are? What is your golden spur?
And I think one thing that's important to understand is a lot of what you're talking about, you've lived. Like you've gone out and started a thing and done it from nothing when like that was scary. And so a lot of this is learned as much as it's observed. So yeah, I'm very curious for this one.
So the thing that drives me, is that the question, or could you be?
That's exactly right. What is it that drives you?
I feel like that I carry, this is going to sound a bit egotistical, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think that everyone who does great things carries a secret, right? Like there's something that they know, something that they feel the world should have more of, and something that's beneficial for people to have access to. And I feel like there's something that I've learned that I know, whether it's through looking at stacks of research that is usually reserved for people going from illness to health and using it really for healthy people, or it's my own journey and kind of coming from, a farm in Pennsylvania and now working with people at a certain level, that I feel like my driver is to touch as many people as humanly possible. My Substack is read in 183 different countries. It's probably the stat I'm most proud of over anything else that, I do, is that my job is really to reach as many people as possible now that I've done kind of the back work and the niche work. And I find incredible gratification in seeing my stamp in great things in the world, whether or not I'm ever attached to them. That is like a shot of adrenaline to me every single day, to see something on the news, to see a new thing come out, to watch something happen in the world, and to know that like I saw this development and was part of something moving forward. No one has to know about it. And to me, I think there's something really beautiful about that. So touch as many people, be a part of incredible things and great things in the world. And I will be doing this when I'm probably 80 years old and using an avatar to make up my appearance so people still want to, engage with me and maybe not believe that I'm almost 100 at that point. So, but yeah, I'll be doing it till the day I die.
Thank you. This has been a phenomenal conversation. Sterling and I are very grateful, and I think any investor or founder that listens to this is going to love it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just got done talking to Dr. Julie Gurner. Knee-jerk reactions, Tyler, synopsis, like what were the thoughts that you were having?
So the knee-jerk is incredibly fun convo. It went by very fast. I think it could have easily gone twice as long. And that's not surprising because she's got just thousands of hours of learnings from the type of people that we all want to learn from that I just wanted to drill into pretty deeply. So loved it. She's phenomenal, excellent communicator, and you can tell that she's been around greatness her whole career.
It's always cool, and I'm sure a lot of people will have seen her tweets, and you just realize how clear writing is clear thinking, and you can actually you could talk for an hour on one little thing, but you can also sum it up in 2 or 3 sentences. I really resonated with a lot of the thinking around leaning into your extremes. And that being what makes you special. And it is challenging because the whole journey, growing up and going to school and all this stuff it's kind of all made to
round out the edges, make you stand in. Yep.
That's right. Round out the edges. And she's somebody who thinks, the rough edges and those extremes are ultimately what's going to set you apart. So lean into those. I really like that.
I love that too, but I also like how practical the other side of the coin is lean into what makes you amazing, spike there, but you can't just let these weaknesses destroy you. You have to shore them up either yourself or by complementing through great hiring. And so it's really practical advice tailored with the whole lean into who you are advice that I think she's learned probably by coaching all these executives who, if they didn't do the other side, end up destroying the company.
I really liked how you were kind of putting together a personality formula for what somebody looks like. And a lot of what investors do is they pattern match based on similar learnings that they've had where, founders succeeded or failed or whatever. But again, when you put together that formula, I think just making sure that you're being very authentic and very sincere in it is going to help you make the best decisions. The worst person you can lie to is yourself.
Yeah.
And so you listen to something like this, you can benchmark and say, well, okay, where do I score high? Where do I score low? What does that sort of lead me to do? I think that was really cool too.
Yeah, I think that's why the formula could work really, because if you hear formula, you think, be the same as others. But if one component of the formula is be you, then I think it can work. And she was pretty clear on that if you just try and copy who Bezos is or Jobs is, you're not being you and you won't win.
It's a real temptation though. But definitionally best practices are average, right? Yeah. And so the more time you spend kind of seeking that out, I think it's mostly a waste if you're trying to do something new. I think probably can help if you're in maintenance mode or something like that, but anyway, fun combo. I think people are really going to like it.
Hope everyone else enjoyed it too, and let us know what you think.